Hello, my name is Shuji Miller, and I'm here to discuss the task, the Staircase Tower, as well as an analysis of some student work that I obtained from the administration of this task to my current students. So the staircase problem is created by Carl 2015, and it presents itself as a group of students who are trying to build a staircase out of wooden square blocks. Now, the first step staircase is shown here as one cube. And the second step staircase is shown here as 3 stacked cubes. Well, how many will be needed to build a 3-step staircase, or even a 6-step staircase? Or how about as far as a 50-step staircase? And ultimately, we want our students to come up with a way to find the total amount of cubes for any n-step amount of staircases. So I adapted this task for my own personal classroom implementation. So what I did was I broke down this task into 6 separate questions with a little bit of my own twist. So I asked my students how many blocks would it take for the 3rd step staircase, as mentioned in Carl 2015's original task. But then I asked my students to sketch what they think the 4th term would look like. And then how many blocks would it take the 6th step and the 50th step, similar to Carl 2015's original task. Then I asked my students to explicitly write a rule for the total number of blocks needed for any nth step and explain how they found that rule. Then I asked them to apply that problem by asking them to find a staircase that has 2,628 blocks and figure out how many steps that was. So my learning objectives were broken up into 3 distinct categories. My first objective was for my students to be able to observe and recognize a pattern and generalize its sequence in formal algebraic notation, which means I want my students to be able to see the pattern of the staircase and be able to write it using algebraic symbols. Then I want my students to be able to determine the future terms of a sequence using approaches like sketches, calculations, or formula. So they have multiple ways that they can find these future terms, but they need to come up with some sort of strategy for it. Then my last objective was for my students to be able to apply their understanding of a generalized pattern by solving problems related to its converse. So whereas students know the nth term of the sequence and want to figure out how many blocks or tiles it takes to make that staircase, well, how about the reverse? What if my students who are given the amount of tiles or blocks inside the staircase, can they figure out how many steps are actually in the staircase? So I implemented this task within my own classroom setting, and I implemented it within my Algebra 1 students and my Advanced Quantitative Reasoning students, which are the 2 content areas I teach in my school. I'm then going to discuss teaching elements such as misconceptions and points of confusions, as well as the models that my students use, and some learning gaps and how to address some of those learning gaps that I saw within my students. I'm also going to share some instructional questions and practices that I implemented throughout the task that really help them understand what to do and how to go about carrying through the task and persevering it. And lastly, I want to emphasize that I won't be discussing every individual student's work because I administered it to quite a few students. However, I will be noting specific trends and notable responses, as well as exemplar models that I thought would be noteworthy of sharing. So let's talk about who I administered this task to. First, I administered it to 8 12th grade seniors. 7 were male and 1 was female, and they're all taking my Advanced Quantitative Reasoning class. One of the males is an English language learner, or ESL as some people call it, or ELL, and one of my males was also receives special education services. My other group of samples were 7 ninth grade freshmen who are 3 males and 4 females, and they are all currently taking my Algebra 1 course. So within this task, I offered several kind of materials and tools for them to engage in the task. I offered them grid paper, as well as counting blocks to help them visualize and model what kind of pattern was going on. They were allowed to use my whiteboard as well as smartboard, so that way they can make very easy and quick calculations and work and be able to erase, change, alter, and color code their work as necessary. I, however, did not allow my students to use a calculator because I was afraid that if they did use a calculator, when they got to figuring out how many tiles it took for the 50th staircase, they would simply find a shortcut. And not really a shortcut, but a shortcut where they would do 1 plus 2 plus 3 all the way to 50 just to get the answer without really feeling the need to create an algebraic expression to help them solve their problems. So no calculator was provided. So for questions 1 through 3, almost all of my students were able to solve these 3 fairly easily. However, What I liked about these 3 questions was that it included multiple ways to enter the task, encouraged my students to look at a pattern and observe the pattern, and they even noticed that it was a recursive pattern. And lastly, it allowed a use of multiple representations as they explored in answering the 3rd question. So as you can see, almost all of my students were able to find the number of blocks it takes to build the 3rd step fairly easily. And they were also all able to accurately draw and sketch the 4th term of the sequence. When they asked how many blocks it would take for the 6th step, however, there was a variety of ways that my students went about it. One of my students saw the pattern and just simply added the sum of all integers from 1 through 6 to get 21 square tiles. Another one of my students took a more visual approach and decided they were going to sketch the 6th term of the sequence to get 21. Another one of my students decided to display their information in a table, as shown here, and they expressed to me that they really wanted to see if there was a pattern between the numbers because they might need it later on. And then another one of my students also added the sum of integers between 1 through 6, but as you can see here, they thought about it in a more recursive manner, where they did 6 plus 5 to get 11, and then they added the one before it, and the one before that, and the one before that, all the way to 1 until they got 21 square tiles. Now, there were different types of models that I observed while my students were working on this task, especially when it came to question 4, which was the heart and core content of this task. So how many blocks would it take for the 50th step? Well, some of my kids decided they were going to pull out the concrete square counting blocks, and they were going to construct a 50th step staircase to count how many blocks it required to build it. Another one of my students used the whiteboard so they could kind of sketch what it would look like, and they decided to take a visual approach. Another one of my students decided they were going to use graph paper because that helped them organize their thoughts more effectively, while many of my students attempted they were going to kind of do the concrete model version, but on paper, where they were simply just going to add the sum of all integers from 1 through 50. So there was multiple ways that my students represented this task, and there were multiple ways that they entered into this task. And they all were able to generalize the pattern, but now it was their job to figure out how that pattern could be used to find the 50th step of the staircase. Now, this allowed them to use concrete and representational and abstract modes into solving this task, starting from the concrete, such as square tiles, or representational, such as visual, and as they realized that these were a little bit more difficult, they started to go into an abstract model of algebraic equation solving, which we'll discuss later on. When it came to the 4th question about how many tiles it would take for the 50th staircase, there were many misconceptions that were seen. One of the first was the students who decided to take a geometric approach. Many of them quickly realized that the staircase resembled a triangular shape and that they could try and find the area of a square around that triangular shape. However, many of them believed that it was a perfect half of a square, and that this made a perfect right triangle. So if they found the area of the square, such as a 50 by 50 square, and split it in half, they would get the right answer. However, they failed to recognize that it was not a perfect right triangle because the edges of the staircase zigzag above the diagonal that forms the triangle that goes from corner to corner, and so there was part of the staircases that was above that diagonal. Some of my students also believed that the total number of staircases was the base and the height of the stairs. So in other words, my students thought it was 50 plus 50, so it was 100 tiles total, not realizing that there were more tiles that comprised the individual steps here in the middle. And lastly, some of my students did not know or were confused about the area of the square, rectangle, and triangles and other geometric shapes that they tried. Other common misconceptions were present when they try a more arithmetic approach. So there were a lot of miscalculations when they tried to go for the calculations of the 50th tile through brute force, simply by adding every single integer from 1 through 50. They also found that it was very cumbersome, which isn't really a misconception, but they believed that it was doable. And with the calculator, it might have been doable. However, I did not provide them a calculator, so they had to do it by hand. And a lot of them found that the recursive pattern was the current term, such as the 50th term, plus the sum of everything from the 49th term. So they believed that that was the formula and that was the answer itself, and that was the solution that was being asked. However, the question was how many tiles did it take to build the 50th staircase? And in order to do that, using this approach, they needed to know how many tiles it took for the 49th staircase, and they didn't know that answer, but they believed that they had already reached the solution. So all the way up until question 4, my students were pretty good about understanding what was happening. They were all able to observe the recursive pattern pretty quickly and pretty easily. However, they had a difficult time going from the recursive pattern to trying to find an explicit formula that would actually help them find the 50th term. Many of them try to settle for using the recursive pattern and adding all the integers from 1 to 50. However, without the use of a calculator, they had a difficult time doing so, and they had a lot of procedural and computational mistakes when they attempted to do it. Many of my students were also confused about geometry formulas, such as the area of a triangle, area of a square or a rectangle, and what those formulas were and how to apply them. And probably one of the biggest points of confusion was my students had a difficult time expressing what they observed in geometric form into an algebraic representation. And they didn't know how to take what they saw and what they could explain to me verbally about the shapes and the patterns that they watched and observed and write it using an algebraic expression. And lastly, after all of my students eventually got an algebraic expression for it, they got different expressions based on the way that they thought about the pattern and how they went about solving it. And they didn't realize that all of their expressions were equivalent, and they thought that other group members were incorrect because their algebraic expression was written differently from theirs. So the first of these approaches that I would like to discuss were my students who decided to take a geometric approach. So one of my students decided to use grid paper and solve their problem using the rectangular method. So they noticed that they could take their staircase and complete it by doubling their staircase to form a rectangle. And they were able to do this and solve this for the 5th sequence, as you can see in this student example, and they figured out that there were 15 blocks necessary for it. However, I then asked them what did they notice about the sides or the lengths of their rectangle, and they quickly noticed that the base for the 5th term was 5, but for this rectangle the height was 6, and they noticed this pattern for other terms of the sequence. I asked them what they would have to do with the negative space that they constructed and how they accounted for it, and lastly how they could turn this observation into an algebraic expression. They quickly realized that if it was the 5th sequence, then the rectangle would be a length of 5 and a width of 6, which is 1 more than n. So n times n plus 1 would give us our length times our width, and then they would divide it in half to get rid of the negative space as shown here. And then another one of my students decided to construct it as a triangle and realized that the diagonal from point to point created half of a square. So they took n squared and divided it by 2, which was the area of the triangle. But then I asked them what did they notice about the figures above the line, and they quickly realized that those spaces were not accounted for in their formula. So they then added half of the amount of triangles there were, because they realized that for every sequence of the term, in other words, in this example, this is the 6th term of the sequence, there were 6 triangles that needed to be accounted for. So they added 6 half pieces, as they called it, back to the original equation to get this expression as shown here. So one of my students, or my group of Algebra 1 students, actually came up with a very unique solution to this problem. Half of the class was trying to take the geometric approach, but this small group of students just could not get the hang of what people were talking about in terms of the area of triangles and rectangles and squares and things like that, and they were trying their very best to find an arithmetic approach. So originally, they started off by trying to add each integer from 1 to 50, and as a group, they decided that they were going to tackle it by each adding an interval of 10. So one student would add all the numbers from 1 through 10, another student would take 11 through 20, and then so on, and once they all got their sums, then they would add them all together, and that was the best way of adding all the numbers. So they didn't really find an arithmetic approach. However, one of the students who was working on numbers 40 through 50 realized that there was a pattern that she saw in the digits. She saw that when she added 49 and 40, or at least the ones place digit of 9 and 0, she got 9. And then when she did 48 and 41, which is 8 and 1, she also got 9, and she realized that she could just add everything in half because they all ended in integers of 9, and then she would add all the 40s that were involved in it. And she explained this pattern that she observed to me, and I asked her if she sees this pattern in the sums, why would she only add it to the ones digit? And could she apply this pattern that she observed using the numbers through all the digits instead of just her specific interval that her and her group was trying to solve? She then realized that if she lined up all the numbers from 1 through 50, that 50 plus 1 made 51. And then the next one down was 49 plus 2, which was also 51. And 48 plus 3 was also 51. And that eventually she would get all the way down until she got to the middle, where she would have to get the sum of 51 25 times. So simply, she knew that since there were 50 numbers, there would be half that amount. So the answer would be 51 times 25, or in other words, 1,275 tiles in the entire cube. So this is called Gauss's sum. And I've actually never had anyone use the Gauss's sum to try and solve this approach, even though this recursive pattern of adding every single integer from 1 through 50 is exactly what Gauss's sum is. So this particular group saw a pattern in the digits and did a very good job of trying to generalize the arithmetic pattern that was happening with the numbers and applying it to a bigger picture, starting with first the ones place with in an interval of 10 and applying it all the way from all the numbers from 1 to 50. And so in the end, she ended up getting the equation n plus 1 times n over 2, because she said if it's the 50th staircase, all the sums add to 51. So this should be 50 plus 1, 51. And she knew that since everything got cut in half, because there would be 25 pairs of numbers, it would be 50 divided by 2, in other words, 25. So she expressed her pattern here and generalized her arithmetic pattern as an algebraic expression. So between these three methods of Gauss's sum, which they got this expression, but the rectangular method, where they received this expression, and the triangular method, where they received this expression, I asked them, all the groups in the end, to come together and compare and contrast their three ideas, and explain how they were similar, or how they were different, and how do they know if their solutions were accurate, and lastly, if all the solutions that they came up with were equivalent. So when I asked them how are these similar or different, they all noted that all of these expressions were completely different and that two of the groups were definitely wrong and that they were the only correct group. So then I asked my students, can they show that their particular expression was the correct one? So each of them went in and plugged in different values for the first term, the second term, sixth term, fifth term, all the way up to the 50th term. And then they realized that every single one of their expressions worked. So they all knew that all of their expressions were accurate. However, they still did not see that each of their expressions were equivalent. So one of the learning gaps that I found was that not every student was successful in determining how each of these were equivalent. Some of my students were able to simplify each of these expressions until they look like one another, but all of my students were not able to do so. The last part of my task that I implemented and added to the original task was the converse, and I asked my students, if a staircase has 2,628 blocks, how many steps would there be, or what term of the sequence would it be? And the majority of my students were unable to do this. Some of my students reverted back to their recursive pattern and they relied on it, and they simply went starting from the 50th term, which they had figured out prior, which was 1,275, and wanted to add 51, add 52, 53, 54, and so forth until they got 2,628. However, they had a lot of computational errors for the same reason that they had difficulty adding the integers from 1 through 50. So this right here showed me that they had a lack of comprehension of the formula, and they had a lack of connection to what the formula actually means and how it's actually used. Now, this particular student recognized that the formula could be used to help them. And so what they did instead was they guessed different terms, such as the 55th term, the 60th term, the 65th term, and plugged it into the formula to see which one would get 2,628 by guessing and checking. And they eventually got the correct answer of the 72nd term of the sequence. So they understood the application of the formula, but they lacked the procedural connection to how to use the formula in a manner that was beneficial in problem solving, because they continued to try and guess and check it instead of working it as the converse. So the students that did recognize that decided to work backwards and set their equation up that found the total area or the total squares of blocks and set it equal to 2,628. However, when they went to work backwards, they multiplied both sides by 2 to get 5,256, but they were unsure how to actually go about solving this. And many of my students did not know how to factor this. Now granted, between my students that were being sampled, part of my students were Algebra 1 students who have not encountered factoring quadratics yet. So I already knew that they lacked the procedural competency to be able to solve this kind of problem. However, I was hoping that my seniors in my AQR class would be able to factor. However, they still lacked this procedural fluency, and they still were not able to solve this quadratic equation because of this learning gap. So, throughout this task, I noticed that there were several learning gaps that my students had. So my students could not make the connection between their procedure and the concept that they were learning. So there was a lack of connection between their procedural fluency and their conceptual understanding between what their formula meant and how it could be used. And they lacked the procedural competency and fluency in factoring and solving quadratic equations. Even my seniors, who had taken Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 and geometry, they still did not remember how to solve a quadratic equation. My students also were not able to connect algebraic expressions to visual representations that they did using geometry models, and they didn't understand conceptually how their algebraic expressions related to those geometric concepts. Lastly, a lot of my students, not all of them, but a lot of my students lacked the understanding of what an equivalent algebraic expression was, because after all of my students found 3 different forms of expressions, whether depending on which method they use, such as the rectangle method, or the triangular method, or even Gauss's approach of the Gauss's sum, they had different algebraic expressions and different representations, but argued that all 3 of them were not equivalent, even though they showed that all 3 of their formulas worked. Therefore, to address these learning gaps that I observed, I decided that there were these certain steps that needed to be taken so that they could reach proficiency. So for the first learning gap of not being able to make connections between their procedural computations and their concepts, I decided that they needed more encouragement and more experiences with verbal and written explanations, justifications, and reasonings behind the procedural computations that they were doing. And that small group collaborations have been very beneficial, such as in this instance, in making those connections as they talked and discussed how their geometric shapes represented algebraic concepts and how they could express one form in another. For the second learning gap, for procedural fluency in factoring and solving quadratics, I feel like this is more of a procedural focus and that they needed a little more practice with how to solve quadratics and understanding inverse relationship between squares and square roots and how to actually solve quadratic kind of equations. Now for my Algebra 1 students, they had not encountered this yet, so it's not necessarily a learning gap in terms of that they did not learn it prior. However, it is something that they are still lacking and missing for this particular task. My AQR kids, this is a big learning gap that they still were not able to solidly get from their previous mathematical experiences. The third learning gap was making the connections between algebraic expressions and their geometric representations and conceptual understandings of it. So I decided that if they were able to require more labeling and identifying geometric aspects using algebraic notation, this would be a very effective method in making those connections. And then I could encourage the understanding of the meaning behind variables as structures, because right now they see the algebraic variables and numbers as just letters and numbers, and not as an item or a structure that represents something in a bigger picture. And The fourth thing that I think I would like to address is the equivalence between algebraic expressions. So my students had difficulty in understanding what the meaning of equality was and how each of those were equivalent, and that they could receive some more practice in how to simplify expressions to show equivalency across one of them. And by practicing skills of manipulating variables and expressions, I think they are able to improve on these learning gaps a little bit better so they would be more mathematically proficient. So this concludes my presentation of the Staircase Challenge. Hopefully you were able to learn a little bit more about my instructional practices, some questions that I use, the misconceptions and learning gaps my students have, and different models and approaches that my students use in solving these tasks. Here are my references for the advices and conclusions that I came across regarding their misconceptions and how to address those, and types of instructional practices that I implemented with my classroom. Hope you all enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching this presentation.